So, John, tell us about your area of study.
Well, ancient history in the broad sense, but my doctoral thesis was on the origins of Christianity, and beginning with Jesus, going through to the early church, but setting in its Greek and Roman background.
Okay, and where did you do that?
Macquarie University, Ancient History Department.
Okay. I have a flat white, thanks.
Oh, a short plate. Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, John, how do we know that the first Christmas actually happened?
Well, no ancient historian has any doubts that Jesus existed. The evidence is frankly overwhelming. I mean, regardless of whether the historian is a Christian historian or a Jewish historian or just a completely irreligious one, we all know the evidence is overwhelming. Not only the Christian evidence, the New Testament evidence, but writings of non-Christians from the first century. So, for instance, there's a text by Mara bar Serapion, who was a pagan, writing probably in the 70s AD of the first century, who refers to Jesus as a wise king executed by his own people.
And you even went over yourself and had a look at the evidence firsthand, didn't you?
Yeah, I've had the great privilege of playing with the only copy of Mara bar Serapion's letter in the British Library.
Mara is in prison, so he's feeling pretty persecuted. But he finds comfort in the fact that some of the great teachers of the past were also treated badly. He refers to Pythagoras, Socrates, and an unnamed wise king of the Jews who was executed.
What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that that their kingdom was abolished. But the wise king did not die altogether. He lived on in the teaching which he had given.
Mara doesn't name this figure, so we can't be certain of the identification. But because no other Jewish man from the period fits the description of teacher, king, and martyr, mainstream historians take Mara's words as a passing reference to Jesus.
Probably the most important evidence is from Josephus, a Jewish historian. This is a man who knew Jerusalem well, had actually been the commander of Jewish forces in Galilee, Jesus' home district. And he refers to Jesus on 2 occasions. And I got to play with a very precious manuscript of Josephus in Cambridge.
Josephus straddled 2 worlds. He was born and educated in Jerusalem, but he lived out his final years in Rome under the patronage of the emperors. And it was there in Rome in the second half of the 1st century that he penned his magnificent 20-volume History of the Jewish People. He could have had no idea at the time that out of everything he wrote, just 2 small paragraphs would capture the world's attention.
At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of baffling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. He was the Messiah. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. For on the 3rd day, he appeared to them again alive.
If you're wondering why a Jewish historian would freely describe Jesus as the Messiah, the anointed king of the Jews, so do most scholars. It seems as though somewhere in the copying process, a rather bold scribe has tried to improve the wording to bring it into line with Christian beliefs. Whatever we make of the 2 debatable lines, most scholars agree that the references to Jesus as a teacher, wonder worker, and martyr do indeed come from the pen of Josephus. In any case, just 2 sections later, Josephus again refers to Jesus, and here there's no suggestion of Christian tampering with the text. In passing, Josephus recounts the execution by stoning of a man named James, whom Josephus calls the brother of the famous Jesus.
Then in the early 2nd century, we have Tacitus, the greatest of Rome's ancient historians, refers to Jesus being executed in exactly the same period the Gospels say he was executed. So from this, we can be absolutely certain that he lived. You have to have the most blind, arbitrary skepticism to reject all of that evidence. And I need to stress, though, it's not just this non-Christian evidence that gives us confidence. Historians take the Christian evidence as well. It just beggars belief that the early Christians would invent a story of their great hero dying on a shameful Roman cross. This was the worst of ancient deaths. This was a great shame and scandal. You wouldn't invent it.
Now, there's obviously a lot of questions about whether you can trust or believe Christian writers. You know, are they just making this up? How do you take those documents and take them seriously?
Well, every text has a bias. That's true of modern texts or ancient texts. I mean, probably the only text without a bias is the telephone book, you know? Even there, I'm sure there's some bias. But we're used to, as historians, we're used to dealing with the bias in a text. But bias doesn't rule out you're using a text. Of course, the Christians had an agenda when they wrote, but that's no different from Josephus, who was a Jew, had a Jewish bias when he wrote. Tacitus was a good Roman. He had a Roman bias when he wrote. I mean, we're used to that. It's no shock to come across a Christian bias. The thing is, bias doesn't destroy testimony. It's a little bit like, would you read my account of my wife versus some so-called objective journalist that had never met her and didn't have a view, but just tried to deal with the fact? Of course, my account's a little biased, but the bias actually gives you intimate access to things a so-called objective account wouldn't. And I think it's the same with the Gospels.
You said you studied history at a PhD level. Did the historians you work with take those scripture writings, the writings of the New Testament, seriously?
Oh, absolutely. You can come to Macquarie University in our ancient history department and do a course on New Testament history because it's a real text. This is really important to understand. Secular historians do not privilege the New Testament as a sacred document, the way a Christian might like us to, but nor do they come to the New Testament with skeptical prejudice. They don't treat it as less than human. Sure, they don't treat it as a divine text, but they don't come to it as if it's, you know, some scandalous text that you can't take seriously. They treat it as a real first century document. And when you treat it like that, it stacks up pretty well. It's a real historical document.
There's this idea around that belief in general is delusional, and even behind the Christmas story, there's almost a delusional idea of that first Christmas. You're suggesting that not just people's experience, but hard evidence would show that's not the case.
Hard evidence tells us that the Jesus story happened in time and space. We can't prove everything in the Jesus story. I mean, no historian really thinks by historical method you can prove everything. But we know we're dealing with real time and space. We know the characters that are mentioned in the Gospels, and Gospel of Luke is a particularly good example because it's so historical. And the opening paragraph of Luke's Gospel says that he has studied the eyewitness testimonies. He tells us that in his opening paragraph. So that instantly tells us we're dealing with historical claims. You might want to reject it, but if you reject it, you're rejecting it against the evidence, not because of the evidence.
Yep. Going over there personally and being and filming and doing a story of the life of Jesus, how did that impact you in the whole story of Jesus?
Well, I guess there are a couple of things. One is it's beautiful to actually be there, you know, to actually be in Bethlehem, where the Christmas story begins.
Luke strikes a theme you find in all four Gospels. Jesus is the Christ, but his kingdom is not about military or political power. The Christmas image of a baby in a manger challenges the expectation of a Messiah on his throne.
And seeing it's quite an ordinary place. And it was in Jesus' day an ordinary place. And it's part of the theme of humility that, you know, is across the whole life of Jesus. But then going to Galilee, where Jesus grew up, to see how beautiful it is. It is gorgeous and fertile and lush. So it is exciting to be where Jesus was, but you know, the overriding experience of going there was that's not where Jesus is. It's not where you find him. Even though people go there for pilgrimages, that's not where you find him. He's alive today. That's the Christian point of view. The history is one thing, and it's fantastic. I love the fact that my faith is grounded in real data. But the thing that really thrills me is that the life of Jesus goes beyond Israel, right into my life all these years later.
Thank you, John. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, mate.